Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to my presentation. I'm Kathy Swart. I'm a faculty librarian and an adjunct humanities professor at Pierce College in Washington. And as we begin, I'd like to say, I want to acknowledge that I live on the unceded ancestral land of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. I give gratitude for this land and for the Duwamish tribe who continue to enlighten others about their heritage. And about the quote on the top of the slide you're seeing there, I don't know if we have any E.M. Forster fans in the room, but, and it's meant to be funny in the book, but the reason for it is that I come across so much misinformation these days that it feels like everything out there is wrong. And of course, that's not true, but it feels that way. And this is what really inspired my sabbatical and the assignments I'm going to share with you today. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what information injustice is, try to define it, how critical theory predicts false narratives, a lot of misinformation, and how these assignments I created could use critical and open pedagogy to try to resolve the problem, or at least respond to the problem. And these are all openly licensed assignments that I'm making available to you, and I hope a lot of you are able to use them or adapt them. So I discovered the problem of misinformation really years ago when I left my textbook behind and replaced it with a variety of library-based and openly licensed sources. The textbook was problematic for a lot of reasons, but mainly because of the token attention they gave to BIPOC and international artists. So I replaced this with a variety of library-based sources and other types of sources, which students really enjoy because of the variety. And in this way, I was able to not just save them money, which is nice, but I created a curriculum that was actually inclusive. The course is Humanities 101, Introduction to the Humanities. But through doing this, I was able to globalize the content and introduce them to artists that will never appear in a lot of textbooks. So when I ask students to, sorry, I'll go back. When I ask students to research these global artists, they would bring me back really bizarre things, a lot of misinformation. And I've been noticing a lot of it lately, and it borders on racism, if not outright racism. And so a lot of the passion I have for this is because of my love of Brazil, and especially my love of bringing students to Brazil and teaching my class in Rio, which I was able to do for 2 summers. And it's interesting that I had only 2 weeks of class with these students, but they all told me the same thing. Before this class, Latin America had never come up in their education, period. So when they started doing research projects, that's when I noticed a lot of faulty information. And I continue to find it, and I want to give you an example. So this is an example from the Opposing Viewpoints database. What makes it extra disturbing is that students tend to think anything that comes from the library is credible. And I'm going to let you take a minute and read these excerpts from the article. Pretty offensive, wouldn't you say? Yes, right. Imagine if you were a student from a Latin American country, an international student, an immigrant, son or daughter of an immigrant, and you read this. This is what is actually frightening. And as I say, I continue to find these problems. So right now, I would like you to take maybe 2 or 3 minutes and see what you can find about the author. His name is Steve Saylor, spelled with an E, not an O. Take a few minutes and see what you can find really quickly about him. this is an activity I do with students. Anyone found anything yet?
Well, white nationalism, alt-right, paleo-conservative.
Good. Holocaust denial, white supremacy, terrible, terrible stuff. Anyone else find anything? We're supposed to be interactive, so I want to give you a chance to speak.
Find anything that was nice or would want me to meet him or even listen to him speak. And but it seems almost like Wikipedia doesn't have anything nice to say about him either, or Google.
It's odd, isn't it? It's pretty bad with Wikipedia. It turns out to be the most accurate source on someone. But what's really disturbing is that this came from a library database, and we tell our students, oh, don't use Wikipedia, go through the library portal and use these databases. And we don't say that they're all authoritative. We can't control all the information that Opposing Viewpoints puts in its database, or ProQuest, or all those. We don't curate the databases. But students still have this association that if it's from the library, it's credible, and this is what makes this so really upsetting. But there are many, many examples. I come across them every day. Here's a few more. So you can find the Black Panthers being called criminals and terrorists. Enslaved Africans were workers. That came from a textbook. The US supported dictatorships across Latin America to prevent communism, which is an old dominant narrative that's false. And also, interestingly, the US doesn't interfere enough in other countries. And that's why it has an immigration problem. You can try to dissect that sometime. And then there's the whitewashing about the number and extent of indigenous peoples affected by colonialism. This is the tip of the iceberg. So when I designed my sabbatical, I wanted to figure out why do we have this situation? We think, the academy is the bastion of liberal ideology, and we embrace all ideas, and we have liberal values and progressive values. How can there be so much false and racist information on our shelves, in our databases? And for that I turn to critical theory, and it's critical theory that explains why. One of the reasons why is that who gets to write the official story is a very small group of people and not very diverse. And I'm sure it doesn't surprise you that the people on this list are not generally the ones who get to write the official story on anything, even if it involves them. So a little bit quotes from Gramsci, one of the famous critical theorists. So he claims hegemony is maintained by embedding dominant ideas, and by dominant ideas, some of these are false narratives, in not only political but social institutions, like schools. Through repetition, these ideas become naturalized. And then academics who aren't aware of this process just unwittingly further the status quo. If you teach the curriculum which is faulty, if you teach it as neutral, then you're just perpetuating the falsehoods. So this takes us to Louis Althusser, who showed how these ideological state apparatuses also are the ones that maintain these, status quo. He points out the education system as the dominant ISA. Now you can see the curriculum as an extension of the ISA. And if this curriculum is presented as neutral, these dominant narratives will continue to go unquestioned. And what really is crucial for us now is that these dominant narratives nearly always omit the voices and experience of marginalized groups. So how do we disrupt this vicious cycle? You can see the cycle here. There's a curriculum, especially when it appears in encyclopedias and in textbooks. We teach that. You know, I did myself as a librarian, as an English professor for years without knowing, without questioning. And so I was unwittingly perpetuating false ideas by steering students to encyclopedias, which can be very faulty. So instead of continuing the cycle, we need to disrupt it. And this brings me to Paulo Freire. So, as you know, he's the author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He's one of the well-known critical theorists. And his idea about disrupting this cycle was to take a strong critical stance on history, society, and politics. And this is really the first step toward meaningful change. As you might know, he grew up poor, but he became a philosopher, and with his wife, Christina, invented a really effective literacy program. But it was more than just teaching people to read. He actually made his students critically aware of their own place in society. And this is what he called conscientização in Portuguese, or critical consciousness. And this is why he was considered dangerous at the time. Interestingly, Paulo Freire himself is the source of misinformation. A lot of people, as Gur Keir points out, don't realize, or they think that Paulo Freire had a problem with teachers having authority in the classroom. This wasn't true. He actually, what he objected to was not authority, but authoritarianism, which he experienced because when the military dictatorship that was happening, shortly after the coup that launched his dictatorship, when they found out what he was doing, they arrested, imprisoned him, and exiled him for nearly 16 years. So he had a problem with authoritarianism, not authority. But this misconception continues because people don't know the context. And I understand why. I sympathize because I didn't know this context myself for most of my life. And so this, one of my extended example of information injustice will concern Brazil's 1964 military coup. So on March 31st, President João Goulart, democratically elected president, was overthrown by the US-backed Brazilian military. They claimed that they were throwing a revolution against incipient communism, corruption, and general chaos. But a big reason why he was overthrown is that the US didn't like him for a few reasons. He was mildly progressive, and as Grace Livingstone points out, the US never likes very progressive presidents in Latin America. He wanted to slow the repatriation of profits to foreign companies. He wanted agrarian reform. He wanted to nationalize resources, especially mining. And I want you to remember the name Hannah Mining. Okay, it comes up later. And worst of all, probably to the US in these days of the Cold War, was that Goulart wanted to remain neutral. He was not a communist, but he wanted to be neutral. So the US role in the coup was very extensive. It spent millions to subvert Goulart, his 62 election. It had a whole operation to help the coup come off if there was resistance, which there wasn't. They financed the coup plotters through business groups, and the CIA did a lot of work with propaganda, creating the illusion of a communist threat. But what happened on that day is the military tanks rolled down empty streets. There was no communist or other kind of resistance, no Soviet stockpiles of weapons, no resistance. The only violence came from the military, who went on a shooting spree that killed 3 unarmed students. Then they started Operation Cleanup, which involved arresting 7,000 people in 1 week for alleged subversion and corruption. Civilians started to be purged from their jobs, arrested, tortured, exiled, and killed. This was very nasty. A lot of people know about the military dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, and they just don't know about Brazil's. It's very strange. So why would the US, this bastion of liberal ideas and cares about freedom, why would it support such a thing? The stated rationale was about communism, which was an idea that was being used as a pretext for a lot of things, even to smear the Black Panthers, as it turns out. But at the same time, the role of the US financial and geopolitical interests was outlined early on, but it was ignored. What got attention was the anti-communism. After the coup, CIA agents told Washington, the change in government will create a greatly improved climate for foreign investments. So we get a sense of what the real reason was there. But one has to wonder, was it worth it? Was it worth all the profit from investment, from cut rate, iron, oil, manganese, access to markets, all the goods that the US government and corporations obtained as a result of this coup? Was it worth the human cost? And to explain the human cost, I want to give a trigger warning, because there's one visual and there'll be a little description of torture. And if you have PTSD, I want to make people aware. If you're sensitive to this, you might want to mute. So one of the most disturbing aspects of this intervention was that the US sent Dan Mitrione, police officer, under the cover of US aid to train Brazilian police in these torture interrogation techniques. He trained 100,000 of the regime's police. According to Martha J. Huggins, this financing led to a complicity with the security apparatuses in Brazil that routinely employed torture as a means of extracting information. It was routine. And with equal viciousness, the dictatorship persecuted suspected members of resistance groups and innocent union organizers, peasant leaders, clergy members, students, a lot of students, artists, journalists. And collectively, they were all called communists, terrorists, or subversives. And this is all without having necessarily committed any crime. The repression involved methods like rape, impaling with pepper-coated rods, mutilating the genitals, ripping off fingernails, water torture, and the most common technique that you see here, the parrot's perch, or pau de arara. And what happened, they would string people up with their hands over their knees and hang them from a pole upside down for hours or days, and with electrodes placed on the most sensitive parts of their bodies, shock them. Many died of this. So here are some of the faces, and here are the numbers. And I wondered if anyone has heard of Theater of the Oppressed. And this is one of among the tortured were Augusto Boal, who created Theater of the Oppressed, Paulo Coelho, a famous author, United States pastor, Fred Morris, who happened to be down there at the time. I don't know if anyone knows who this is on the left in black and white. It is the same. It's a picture of her back in the 70s, and this is her closer to today, and she is Dilma Rousseff, former president of Brazil. And these faces are people who were tortured to death. And the first two in the top row, I say that they're tortured to death because they committed suicide as a direct result of their torture, because it was so heinous. So this was extremely serious. What's saddest, well, I don't know how to quantify sadness, but they even tortured children. And here is Carlos Alexandre, and he was tortured under the age of 2, and at age 39, he committed suicide as a result. So I knew this incredibly sad story well, and I knew the library, I'm a librarian, had all good works on it. So I expected when students went out to search artists like Cildo Meirelles or Antonio Henrique Amaral, they would come across this history and provide it as context, but they didn't. And this is what they brought back instead. Goulart was a communist. Before the 1964 revolution, Brazil was a communist country. And I was shocked. And of course I asked, what sources did you use? And one used a public library reference book, one used declassified CIA propaganda. And I said, okay, let me just do my library role here and use this as a teachable moment and show you the good stuff. So I went looking for the authoritative sources. And what do you think I found? I found the same false narratives and the same lies. Here are some of the lies. So instead of the coup, they called it a revolution. These sources, encyclopedia and a handbook. Instead of dictatorship, republic. Dictators were champions of democracy and praiseworthy. The civilians who opposed the regime were guerrillas and terrorists. The victims of the dictatorship were violence-minded. Just blame the victim here. The economic miracle is since been debunked, and yet it's they still tell the same story. They was okay, they tortured all those people because at least the economy improved in the short term. The landless peasants who were being driven off their land were called exploiters, and the reasons for the coup was progress and development. The omissions, US involvement in the coup, the financing of the whole coup, and the repression against Brazilians and the US role in that. This is consistent. So, as any good librarian would do, right, I went and looked at the authors, and this is what I found. I don't know if the name Dulles rings any bells for any of you. Yeah, okay, I see you laughing. Yeah. Are you kidding me? Right. Okay, J.W.F. Dulles was the son of John Foster Dulles and the nephew of Allen Dulles, both notorious CIA people who threw the coup in Guatemala in 54 and Iran in 53. I mean, why? Oh, sorry, this is where Hannah Mining comes in. He was also executive director of Hannah Mining, which once they got rid of Goulart, stopped the process of nationalizing and just kept exploiting Brazil for really, really cheap iron and really good quality iron. And he got rich off this. So that's one. The other is actually, he has a long title. He's an investment principal and co-portfolio manager at Cambiar Global Equity and International Small Cap Strategies. That's a mouthful. So considering the role U.S. financial investments played in driving the coup, you can see why this author might want to downplay the role of U.S. financial interests and the U.S. role in the coup. But this is a reference handbook, and reference books are supposed to be unbiased, and or at least to give both sides or different sides. They're supposed to be objective, but he glosses over all the human rights in one offhand remark and mentions nothing about U.S. involvement. So I think we have to question these ethics. Do you think the college textbooks I looked at were any better? Anyone want to venture a guess? No. Sadly, they were just as bad. And for the sake of time, I won't go into detailing, but pretty much the same lies, the same omissions as the encyclopedias. So my whole world of librarianship started to turn upside down. But we need to point out the role of the media. So in 1964, 80% of the media praised Brazil's coup. And I think this is a really interesting quote. So they managed to hide the US involvement in the coup and present a skewed version of reality. It served US interests, but at the cost of misleading the public and perpetuating the Cold War mentality. And this itself had terrible consequences. The Life magazine and Reader's Digest both contributed to the propaganda about the communist menace in Brazil. These articles, I usually share them in person. I actually pass them around, and they are it's a dark humor. They are so laughably McCarthyite and undocumented claims, lies, terrible. But this is what I seem to be finding was that you take this 1960s propaganda, it fossilizes into these sources that we consider authoritative. And this is how these dominant narratives keep being spread. And when you think about who was involved in throwing the coup, these folks. Who do you think writes the official story about Latin American history? Yes, the same folks. So how is this unbiased and objective? It's not. And these are the consequences. This is Pinochet, and this is the scene from the stadium, one of the stadiums, where they held thousands of people and tortured thousands of people. I can't help thinking that if somehow the US, some journalists had punctured the Cold War narratives earlier, this terrible thing in Chile may not have happened. 30,000 dead, at least. So, I know, I'm sorry, things have been pretty dark, so I'm gonna lighten things up with little John Oliver. Anyone like John Oliver out there? Yeah, okay. I'm going to press play, and I'm really hoping this works. You guys hear it?
Amazon rainforest looks like it's got no wax. Now, President Dilma Rousseff has spent the whole week dealing with developments in a corruption scandal which threatens to undermine her entire government.
Brazil's Supreme Court has approved an investigation into some of the country's top politicians. They're accused of taking bribes in exchange for lucrative oil contracts from the state-run oil company Petrobras.
Now, when they say taking bribes, this isn't your standard $5,000 in an envelope left under a bench. Because Brazil's largest construction and engineering firms allegedly paid at least $800 million in bribes and other funds to secure contracts. $800 million! You'd need an amazing construction firm just to build a bench large enough to hide that bribe underneath. More than 30 members of Rousseff's ruling coalition are under investigation. So she took to the airwaves this week to try and calm people down.
Você tem todo o direito. You have every right to get irritated and be worried, but I ask for patience and understanding because this situation is transitory.
Is it? How is it transitory? Because unless you're about to flash the entire country with one of those memory-erasing sticks from Men in Black, I don't think people are going to forget about this. In fact, Brazilians weren't even listening to her speech for a pretty
Okay, and move on from there. Don't know if you guys caught any of that. Sorry, need to move forward. Okay, so Dilma Rousseff's impeached for her corruption. I actually saw this in an encyclopedia article, and guess what? She was not impeached for her corruption. And just the other day, they finally cleared her of all charges. She never had any charges of corruption. She was impeached, which many call a soft coup, for fiscal pedaladas, which is creative accounting that all Brazilian presidents have done forever, and it was declared legal 2 days after she was ousted. And in fact, the people who ousted her have admitted that she didn't do anything wrong, and they got rid of her because she didn't want to install the extreme austerity plan that they wanted. So John Oliver, I lost a lot of respect for him. I loved him, but somehow even he was involved in spreading these lies, but New York Times was hugely responsible for a lot of them. Rusev corruption, it's just simply not true. Why do the lies get promulgated but not the truth? So this car wash investigation, which is too much to go into now, it targeted Dilma, it targeted Lula, who was the president before her. It jailed him illegally so that this guy could come to power. Anyone know who he is? Recognize his face? Bolsonaro, president of Brazil now. Really, really hard on people of color, marginalized peoples in Brazil, doing terrible things in the Amazon. So this is a quick video to show you what's happening to the area of what happened to the area of the Yanomami Indigenous people since the coup against Dilma. I'm trying to make this bigger, but you can see. This is a deforestation of the indigenous lands just since she was ousted in 2016. And it continues. So we can complain all day, I can complain all day about these problems, but what I want to do is make a solution. How do we counter false narratives? Okay, one way is by teaching students critical practices, and I don't mean just evaluating briefly sources, but diving deep. And then how we can engage students in creating information that amplifies those excluded voices, the voices excluded from those materials we were talking about. So I created these sabbatical assignments. I put the link in the Padlet. I can just give you a little overview here. And I recommend that you use the assignments by purpose. And so they try to achieve three things: amplify suppressed voices, thank you, identify and respond to misinformation, and transition to OER. I think, especially these days, we really need to amplify the marginalized voices. And here is an assignment. I just want to show you what they look like. I think of them as templates. I want you to think of them as templates. Each one has an overview for faculty, an example of how a student could use the assignment, an assignment overview for students, in this case, a list of topics, some instructions on openly licensing a product that they make, if that's part of the assignment, and how to openly license images, which is hard, and an assessment rubric. All of these, notice that it's licensed and you can do whatever you want with it. You probably come up with even a better assignment from this. But this assignment features Marielle Franco. So these two people point out in this paragraph that high school students rarely ever learn about Latinx groups or their leaders, especially when these leaders are women. Marielle is a wonderful example. She was Afro-Brazilian, bisexual, a woman who came from the favelas and actually became a city councilor. She was a wonderful person. She spoke out against the military occupation of Rio, which targeted Afro-Brazilian young men and killed a lot of them. And for speaking out, she was assassinated. This is a really important story, and one that pretty much anyone I talk to in the US doesn't know about. And so here I've listed topics, women, for people to research. I don't do this on every assignment because I am only a librarian and adjunct professor, and I know I'm going to leave it to the discipline people to actually know. I would assume they know who are the marginalized voices in my field, who are the artists or the scientists that don't get the attention they deserve, and then you build the assignments around them. So the second group is about identifying and responding to misinformation. And I chose challenging authority for this one. And this one was inspired by the Steve Saylor terrible article that I showed you in the beginning. So I actually have students look for an extreme and a biased, some information that is unjust, information injustice. And then they do their own research, lateral reading. They read about the author, they uncover who they are, why are they writing this, and then they write the person responsible for publishing the information, in this case a database, and request the change, like I have done many times. And here's an example, a sample letter. And I actually wrote this letter because of some misinformation about Chile. So students have a model to go on. Then they can openly license this letter and throw it out there in the world. And this is a way of getting information out there that otherwise wouldn't be, that would be almost impossible to find. Now I noticed when I've done this, students get so engaged. It's completely incredible how they change when they realize that someone out there in the world might see their work. The last group is about transitioning to open education. I know a lot of people say, oh, OER, it's hard, it's a lot of work. Some OER stuff is not, as we know, I'm sure you've heard at this conference, is not even inclusive at all, but it can be made inclusive. But for faculty who would like to supplement their courses with more inclusive materials, there's this group of assignments. And this is where students actually go out and gather potential readings for a potential, for future iterations of the class. And I try to work in the critical aspect, even on these other assignments. So for example, this one, the example is how the FBI program COINTELPRO targeted African-American activists. And so students are asked to write glossary entries about topics pertaining to underrepresented groups. They do research, again, they are supposed to find a variety of sources, look at different perspectives, and then they publish their glossary entry, and then the faculty can keep it, and then the next class comes and improves upon them. And believe me, after having done this once, I see that this iterative process is wonderful, because my first round of glossaries were very problematic. A lot of them just were very error-ridden. So you probably heard about the non-disposable assignment. That these also work for students for that reason. They know that their work is going to be used by someone in the future. And one student, I just have to tell you, she chose for her book, I Rigoberta Menchú. And she was not doing good work in my class as far as, grades were low, she didn't show up a lot. And then she changed when it came to this project, and she did an amazing PowerPoint about this book, historical context. She analyzed the theme, everything. It was incredible. And I talked to her about it afterwards, and she said, you know what? I have Mayan ancestry, and I knew nothing about this history. I knew nothing about the Mayan people in Mexico and Central America. And so it was a joy for me. And I say, if we keep saying, it appears we say a lot, we want our students to see themselves at Pierce College. We want them to see themselves in the curriculum. Then we need to be promoting these people from marginalized groups in the curriculum. So that is all I have to say. And do we have a few minutes for questions? Ask away.
Hi, this is James. I just want to say thank you very much. I really appreciate your grounding your work so clearly in your discipline and in a specific time and place, and illustrating the utility of instructors taking control of their content and not relying on, in your case, outsourcing through library vendors who provide materials for the databases, but also for commercial textbook publishers. So thank you for a really clear illustration of what we can do if we educators control our curriculum rather than outsourcing it.
You're so welcome, and thanks for noticing that.
Hi, this is Monica Landeros. I just want to comment, and I might be just really old school, but the term Latinx for people of my generation is a little bit jarring, especially when, in terms of the context of historical people. You know, Rigoberta Menchú would not be Latinx. Dolores Huerta, I haven't been to a lecture in a while, but I don't think she's Latinx. And so I have multiple generations of LGBTQ people in my own family. None of us are Latinx. None of the people I've ever met in Latin America are Latinx. And so I feel that sometimes we're taking a term that's easy for Americans to use in the media to just apply to everyone. And we do have a gender non-specific term, and that's Latin American, just as it is with African American. And so it's just a comment on how sometimes I've seen this kind of, spreading through, and it's mostly media. I am surprised when I see heartfelt academics using it. So it's just a comment. It's not a critique. I understand why people are using it, but I felt that I had to share my own personal experience with the term.
Oh, thank you so much. And I really value that, because I have gone back and forth with Latinx myself, because when I've gotten corrected the other way, when I said, Latino or Latina, and then they say, no, you should use Latinx. And then here I am, Brazil is the biggest country in South America, and Latinx does not apply. Latina, they are not. They're come from Portugal, right? And Africa. So and when the last article I read on this, there was no resolution. They couldn't suggest anything, but I'm going to say Latin Americans from now on. Just thank you, because
Sharon has her hand raised.
Oh, sorry, Sharon.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to tell you thank you. I am one faculty in the OFAR cohort. And so your presentation today really made my project very clear for me. And I'm looking forward to going through some more of your materials. So I appreciate it. And I wanted to respond to the Latinx terminology. It's the same conflict with Black versus African American. So you're going to hear in different spaces who want to be identified under what category. And I think as long as that particular group self-identifies with that terminology, then it's okay. So I have young Latinx students who identify, and if it's a self-identification, it's positive reaffirmation of what they want to identify with, then that's okay. My family is from Central America. Some identify as Latinx, they speak Spanish. Others identify with Black. Many don't want to be called African American. So I think it depends on who the group you're referring to. And I think you don't necessarily have to sway back and forth. You can ask the audience what the terminology you prefer to be, what affinity group do you identify with?
That's great.
But I just want to say, I think that education is important, because I didn't know that there was a discrepancy between with the term. I thought that was just a kind of a popular shift now that the community was taking as a whole. So thank you for that, because I did not know that. So I really appreciate it.
I do too. Thank you. I'm going to keep working on this, how to do this. I put the link in the Padlet to all the assignments, and I will be shortly emailing out all the slides to Peralta so that you can look at the slides and see. I have 2 pages of references because I'm a librarian, in case you're curious about where this information came from.
So we're right up against the hour at 4:45, and I wanted to know if you had any closing remarks or if anyone else had any questions before we end today's session.
My closing remark would be that for me, it's about compassion. When I teach my class, the final project is to create art around some of the stories that students have heard or seen, and they create the most beautiful art. Songs, I've had dances, plays, poems, amazing. And it's about empathy. And I feel like students can abstractly learn about racism and bad things that happen far away. It's all abstract. But if you can make it personal by studying individuals. I bring people from Chile, from Brazil into my classroom. I have them read their stories. I have them watch the movie, the films. It becomes real, and no matter what political persuasion they may be, they are moved. And I think this is how we make change.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all the guests for coming today. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Look forward to seeing you.